Hello and welcome back to The Pisky Trap, a series where we explore the folklore, history and legends from across Devon and Cornwall. It's lovely to be back again after a few weeks away. Things feel very autumnal here in Towerdreth, with a blanket of leaves everywhere and the temperature starting to drop. But I quite like that autumn wintry feel to the air. Before we get started, I just have to say a massive thank you to everyone over the past few weeks who has taken the time to come out to the recent talks on dark tales of Cornish smuggling. We had some fantastic audiences across all the venues, and it was lovely to chat with some of you afterwards as well, to hear your stories and little discoveries that people have been making about smuggling here in Cornwall. Thanks as well to all the fantastic venues for having me back again. That's pretty much it for talks this year. Over the next couple of months, I'm now going to begin the research process again in preparation for more talks in 2026. And it'd be great to hear from you guys if there are particular topics that you'd like me to explore in future talks. Are there local stories or themes that we haven't yet explored that you think might make for a good talk? If you have any thoughts or ideas, then please feel free to drop me a line. I'd love to hear them. You can email me at thepiskytrap@gmail.com or drop me a message on Instagram or Facebook. That's pretty much it for news, so let's get on with the episode. This is one that I've been wanting to put together for a while, because it's something that crops up all the time in little ways when I'm researching for the series. And that is the Cornish language. For example, in researching the Cornish sea monsters episode, we had the accounts and sightings of Morgawr, meaning sea giant. And in the St. Michael's Mount episode, we talked of how Richard Carew mentions the name Carracloes and Coes for the site there. And Cornish place names, their origins and perhaps their meanings, has always been fascinating to me. And at this point, it seems fitting to add in a little update. A little while back, I put together an episode entitled Spectral Lovers, and we explored the story of Nancy Trenawarth, who is said to have lived at a little hamlet in West Cornwall that at the time I pronounced Olsia, because that's the way it's spelled and how it reads, and at that time I didn't actually know anyone who knew the site. However, the other day, my uncle, who had once worked there, tells me that locally it's pronounced Alia. So it's something I'm constantly encountering in different ways. There were also little words and phrases that I grew up hearing as a kid here in Cornwall that I've always been curious about. Words such as teasy, which would often be used to describe someone who's tired and irritable, or smeechy, for when the kitchen gets steamed up. And I've always wondered whether any of these words have their roots in the Cornish language. In recent years, it feels like there's been a growing interest and appreciation for the language, and we're seeing artists producing new music, creating films, publishing books, all in Cornish, which to me is really exciting. As someone who currently doesn't speak Cornish, although it's one of my goals, I knew that I wanted to chat with someone who both speaks the language and has a good knowledge of the subject. And so I thought, who better to chat with than Owain Holland, host of the Cornish Language podcast. I've frequently asked Owain for his advice in the past on pronunciation of certain Cornish words for the podcast. And so I thought it would be fun to sit down and have a chat about the Cornish language. So, a few weeks back, we did just that. And in this episode, you're going to be hearing from our conversation as we chat about the language, its roots and its history, the process of learning, words and phrases, place names, and touch a little bit on folklore as well. So, without any more of my waffling, here's our next episode, the Cornish language. I set out from Penzance with the landlord of the principal inn for my guide towards Sennen, or the most western point. And when I approached the village, I said that there must probably be some remains of the language in those parts, if anywhere, as the village was in the road to no place whatever, and the only alehouse announced itself to be the last in England. My guide, however, told me that I should be disappointed, but that if I would ride about 10 miles about on my return to Penzance, he would conduct me to a village called Mousel, on the western side of Mounts Bay, where there was an old woman called Dolly Pentreath, who could speak Cornish fluently. A quote there from Sabin Baring Gould's Cornish Characters and Strange Events, where he himself is quoting from the writings of Daines Barrington, who we're told travelled to Cornwall back in 1768 to try and find out the extent to which the Cornish language was still being spoken. And here we have the mention of this woman called Dolly Pentreath, a name that I grew up hearing about, as over the years she's often been referred to as one of the last fluent speakers of Cornish, though in recent years that's been called into question. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to Dolly Pentreath, and I think it's a topic that warrants its own episode at some point. If we were to go back further in time, according to Hitchens and Drew in their survey of Cornwall from 1824, and I quote, "The Cornish language was current in a part of the South Hams in the time of Edward I. Long after this, it was common on the banks of the Tamar, and in Cornwall it was universally spoken. But it was not till towards the conclusion of the reign of Henry VIII that the English language had found its way into any of the Cornish churches. Before this time, the Cornish language was the established vehicle of communication." I was keen to know more about Cornish, this fascinating Celtic language that presumably my ancestors must have spoken. And so, to find out more, I recently sat down for a chat with Owain Holland, a fluent speaker of Cornish, author and host of the Cornish Language podcast. And I began by asking Owain how he first got started in learning the language. What brought you to the Cornish language, and how did you kind of get started, I suppose?
What brought me to it in the first place was kind of just, I get the circumstance of my family, really, because my granddad was quite into it, and he had, when I was a kid, he had, Cornish language like material, like books and things, and he was big on Cornish nationalism and things, and he taught me the first bits of language that I knew. And my grandma, his wife, she's quite big on folklore and things like that, so she'd have loads of stories about, I don't know, piskies and knockers and what have you. And my granddad, he was like a salty old seaman type guy. He'd been a sailor for like 20 years and been all over the world, but come back to Cornwall, and he was just a quintessential Cornishman, I guess, and he just impressed that on me when I was a kid. And I didn't learn it to fluency initially. I just knew words and phrases. I knew about it. I knew basic phrases and numbers and what have you. And I had little books and dictionaries and stuff that he'd given me over the years. And I think it was either when he passed away or when he was close to passing away, I was like, I want to learn Cornish. He'd learned it off his mum, who was an early Cornish revivalist, and I only ever met her like once or twice. Spoke to her very, very few times, but she taught him what he knew, and then he passed that to me. And I was like, well, he's no longer going to be with us. I missed all that chance to ask him any questions or learn more. So I'm gonna sign up to some lessons and learn it fluently. And that was my early 20s sometime. And about took me 4 years to gain, sort of fairly good fluency. From there, I just decided this is in an ideal world, this is the language I'd want to speak. So I'm going to involve myself in it as much as is possible with the media and community that's out there. It's not possible to be fully immersed as you would be in a large language like English or French, where you could spend your whole day watching TV or listening to the radio or working just using that language and nothing else. Whereas in Cornish, you'd run out of all the media to watch or listen to or read very quickly. So there's only a certain amount of embedment you can have currently because there's not enough stuff being created out there that would create, such an immersive language to be within, like English. So I wrote books and had the idea for starting my podcast at some point. I know it's not fully in Cornish. The idea is more to provide some background and extra curricular learning for people rather than Cornish language content. But yeah, that's how I got to the point of where I am really.
I love that because I can some of that really rings true for me as well in terms of the influence and the impact of grandparents because I think that was where a huge amount of a lot of my I remember hearing stories, particularly folklore related things, old myths and legends, but also there were little words that I pondered, that would be sometimes there were phrases that I assumed were just general phrases that people used all over, words that would be thrown out like teasy,
Yeah,
or smeechy or things like that. And I don't know how much those are colloquialisms. Do you think that some of those have their roots in the Cornish language as well? I think,
definitely do. A load of the sort of more common surviving Cornish dialect words do come directly from Cornish. Like teasy comes from Tezek, which is a word in Cornish. I'm not sure about smeechy. I don't know if that comes from a Cornish language word. I'm not sure. Kind of sounds a bit onomatopoeic to me. Like
yeah,
I don't know, but yeah, there's plenty of them. Like scat, that that just means to hit in Cornish. It comes straight from Cornish, and I guess 100 or more years ago, like Cornish dialect was a lot stronger and a lot more Cornish than it is now. Like there was a full like Cornish English sort of dictionary where you could have loads of words and phrases, and not all of them are used anymore. But some will still come up and surprise me. Like someone in work came to me the other day and he said, "Where'd you trig to?" And I was like, I'd never heard that before in Cornish dialect, but trigger is the verb for like to dwell or live. And this guy doesn't speak Cornish; he just Cornish dialect, and he just said it to me. Obviously a word he'd learned as a kid or whatever, and that took me by surprise because I was like, I understand it exactly, but I've never heard it in English, and we use it all the time in Cornish. So yeah, there are definitely words out there that come directly from Cornish language that are used every day in Cornwall still.
I love discovering things like that. It's lovely to be surprised as well. But yeah, because I remember one that always stuck with me was as a child was my gran would always call woodlice grammar sows, and I
Yeah,
think that is a Cornish word, isn't it?
yeah, yeah. Gramazau is the Cornish word for woodlouse. Yeah, my nan used to call them grant for sows. Like it sort of changed. Like the word became like a grandmother instead
Yeah.
of grandma. Yeah, but yeah, that is a Cornish word for woodlouse.
It's brilliant because I was talking to someone about this the other day, and they're like, they were like, "Oh, I grew up on the North Coast, and we have a different word for it." So you've clearly got the roots are clearly the same, but you've got these little regional variations,
Yeah,
and that's always fascinating to me because you can see how at one time there'd have been such little differences, and that's amazing to me as well.
yeah, exactly. And someone from the St Just area would have been different from someone from the Lizard, or and way different from someone from East Cornwall. So there definitely was regional variations, and a little extent there still is with some people, but I think you'd notice it a lot less these days.
I think you notice it a little bit in, although it gets kind of diluted a little bit with accents as well. You can start to, after a while, you start to think, oh, I can
Yeah,
sort of guess what area of Cornwall you might be from in terms of just the little subtle changes and differences in the accent. You kind of go, well, that's clearly a lot of my family are from Penzance and
yeah,
Senna, so West Cornwall, and that I kind of instantly know that quite well. And I've grown up mostly around sort of Pass and Austell, St. Blazey,
yeah, yeah.
so I know that. But
See,
you know.
that's kind of the opposite for me because I live in Penzance, and I originally come from St Blazey, Towerdreth, Boyd area. So yeah, all my family was mostly from that area.
That's hilarious. So we've literally done a swap.
Yeah.
How funny is that? But I suppose a good place to also kind of talk about at the outset is for people who are sort of not familiar with Cornish language at all. How would you kind of explain the Cornish language and how it relates to maybe other Celtic languages?
Yeah, so it absolutely relates to all the other Celtic languages in some respect. They're all the same language family. Cornish is so the Celtic language family is split in half into sort of Gaelic languages and what they call Brythonic languages. So essentially, languages that originate in Ireland and languages that originate in Britain. And Cornish, Welsh, and Breton are the Brittonic languages, and they're all really quite close. Like you can understand phrases and words in those languages between each other. It's said, and I'm not an expert because I'm not fluent in the other two languages. I'm only fluent in Cornish, so I can only say from my experience as a Cornish speaker what I think about the others. I can't, from an academic standpoint, I'm not an expert on the other two. But to me, it seems that Cornish and Breton are most grammatically similar, but modern Breton speakers have generally a very strong French accent. So it's kind of hard to see what they're saying. If you see it written down, you can make more sense of it. But a lot of them have quite a strong accent that it's hard to get past because at first glance, a modern Breton speaker might sound like they're speaking French until you realize you can't understand those words as French because it's quite a strong French accent. But Welsh, on the other hand, is way more easy to understand. The accent is totally comprehensible, but the grammar's different. And I did a podcast with a guy called Doc Cymraeg. He's like a Welsh language educator and a teacher. And I sort of through my discussions with him, I sort of came up with a theory. There's a way that you can speak Welsh and Cornish to make them more comprehensible to each other. Like if you spent a bit of time together and interacted, you'd you'd work out what the grammatical similarities are and use those. Maybe it's a less everyday way of speaking Cornish, but if you used a more formal way of speaking, it might make it more understandable to the Welsh person. If they use a strange way of speaking to them, they can make it more understandable to you. And then the Irish and Scottish and Manx Gaelic there, I find it very hard to understand anything by listening to it. The odd word will be the same, but it's I think you'd have to learn the languages a bit before you found out what the similarities were because they've changed quite a bit since they were evolved, so they're less comprehensible. What I find more interesting is how Cornish is similar to other European languages. So Celtic languages are quite distantly related to like languages that derive from Latin. So my partner's Italian, so I learned a bit of Italian from her and her family, and actually finding out how similar Cornish can be to Italian, like how many words are the same or derive from Latin or something, is quite interesting. There's quite a lot of shared vocabulary between some of the Latin derived languages, French or Italian or Spanish, and I'm sure if you knew Cornish, it would make it easier to learn one of those languages just because there are some similarities that make it quite similar.
Did that help? Did you find when you were learning that helped in the sense of having those kind of roots, that there were little things that your brain kind of goes, oh, I can sort of piece this together because they had the roots of them. Because did you, like I had to learn French, for example, at school. So, and
Yeah,
I quite enjoyed that and I found that really, really interesting. So then that becomes the base point for when you're learning languages. You're maybe subconsciously kind of comparing and going, oh, that's similar. I can see where that root
yeah,
is from.
yeah. And French and Italian, I'd say, are more similar to Cornish than they are to English in their grammatical sense. So the way they use the verbs and stuff would be more similar to Cornish. So I think if you know a different grammar, it helps you pick up a further grammar of another language. It's probably not just Cornish. It's probably if you knew English and I don't know Italian, you'd pick up French really easy. It's just how languages work. Once you know more than one, you be like, oh, I understand how things can be different now, I guess. But yeah,
And when you were learning, was it Were you able quite early on to be able to kind of, as part of the learning process, was it a lot of reading from texts, or was there possibilities for kind of speaking and learning the sort of the practical side of it along the way?
Yeah, there's both. And it always depends what kind of learner you are, really. I did a level 3 course in adult education, like to be a to be able to teach people, and that opened my eyes to like how different people, different minds learn things, and not everyone learned things the same. And when I was learning, I suppose before I actually took formal courses throughout my life, I'd always have had Cornish language books that I'd, just flick through and pick stuff up, and not made a dedicated effort like I'm going to learn everything in this book, but just absorbing things through the book, just through reading, before I eventually decided to start formal lessons. And I think trying to use every aspect you can is probably the best way to approach it. um, we live in a day and age where everyone pretty much is literate, so if you have the ability, you should definitely try and read things and you know speak, listen. Language isn't just one sort of facet, it's multifaceted. There's you know Imagine if you only learned English to be able to read it and not speak it or write it or listen to it. It would make it super hard. And I remember the way we had to learn French in school, it was like divided strictly between like reading, writing, and listening and stuff. And like, well, if you're to become fully fluent in a language, you need to be able to do all those and like simultaneously. And I think there's an extra dimension that you need to be able to think in a language as well. So it's not just doing the process of reading something in English on a paper and then translating it into Cornish or French. You have to be able to like think in Cornish and write something. So to do that, you need to literally, to become fluent, you need to take every aspect you can of the language and involve that in everyday tasks, really.
It's so true in terms of how you describe learning at school, how it was really divided up into those categories. Because for me, I always looked forward to the speaking exercises because to me, the speaking exercises felt like playtime. It felt like you
Yeah,
had a bit of free reign, that you were having to take everything that you'd started to learn from the other areas and you bring them together. And it's like problem solving. You're listening to what someone's giving you in terms of the conversation. You're thinking about your response, and then you've got the freedom to how you're then going to articulate yourself. But it then, I suppose, because I'm one of those people who learns quite practically, I like the idea of learning. This is how I'm practically going to be using this in a conversational way. But it must be so. I guess it's just different for everyone. But I always really looked forward to those little moments.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that's true. And the way we acquire language initially is we are very young children, and practically everything we learn is through playing and finding out. So when you're trying to learn a language, I think that's a really good approach. And it doesn't need to be limited to speaking exercises. You can, I think, one of the best things I'd advise someone who wants to learn a language is go out and buy a load of kids books in that language. The ones where you have to open the flaps, or they're like little stories and tiny bits of text and stuff, because that's really easy to learn. And if you set yourself up to learn as a kid's learning, one, you're not going to fail because you're going to learn it because it's easy to learn. A kid can learn it, so you can because you've done it in a different language, and build up from there rather than jumping into a full-on academic textbook or a grammar book. And some people might be able to do that, and if you can, then just go for it and do it as you want to. If you want to learn the nitty-gritty about how grammar works, then you obviously know what you're doing, and go and do it. But for most people, I'd suggest go and get kids books, go and get nursery rhymes or whatever, and learn those. And I've had to do that now because I've got kids, so I've had to do all of that anyway regardless. But before, it wasn't something I had attempted before. I'd gone the way of, formal lessons, I'll get the workbook and work through the lessons with the teachers and stuff. And if you're not really dedicated into it, it might, I've seen it puts people off, because then, like, I left school 20 years ago. I don't really want to put myself through school again, which is, fair enough. Some people like it and some people don't for many reasons. And, I would suggest learn as a child. That's how we all learn in the first place. And if you're learning something so basic and fundamental as a language that you want to learn up to fluency, go and start from the very beginning and buy kids' books. And one, you can't fail. It's easy. And you're building a little success along the way. You're like, right, I've done the kids' books. I'm building up to bigger stuff. And you've always got more simple stuff to fall back on. You've got loads of basic sentences and vocabulary. So I think that's a really good way to learn, and use any media that's possible. I know we've not got a lot in Cornish as compared to other languages, but there's still stuff out there. There's YouTube shorts, there's cartoons, there's a radio service. So anything you can possibly use it.
Something I was going to ask is, have you looked much at the history of the Cornish language? And I wanted to get your thoughts on. I was reading the other day. I think it was in a book by I've got it. Julian Holmes. I think it's about Cornish place names.
Yeah. I've seen that one. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I think it was in there. There was a reference to people who were speaking Cornish in the area, like the South Hams area of sort of South Devon into the medieval period. I don't know if you've looked much at the kind of the history of the Cornish language, and I was chatting about this with my mate Ryan yesterday. Shout out to Ryan. Um, Talking about how borders kind of change. Now, obviously, we think of Cornwall, we think of the Tamar as a strict border. Obviously, going back 1,000 years and things like or beyond, borders weren't necessarily that strict. You've got the sort of the little bits of migration of language. Have you kind of looked much at the sort of the history of the Cornish language and how it's kind of uh, moved and evolved?
Yeah. When I studied the final grade in Cornish, you have to do a bit about Cornish language history. Usually focuses on a bit of a more recent period. So they're quite focused on the later era of when Cornish was dying out as a community language. So that's when it's kind of focused on. But yeah, what you say back then is really interesting, because we have the really ancient history of when Cornish was, it had not long been its own language. They think the earliest written Cornish comes from like 800s or something like that, which is around the time of when the fixed border became into place as the River Tamar. But yeah, we have there's records in, is it called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle or something, of like the Cornish being driven out of Exeter. And you think, well, if that only happened like the same year as the border was fixed at the Tamar, there must have been a whole load of people either relocated or still living in what is now Devon. And I think there's a great book by a historian called Craig Weatherhill,
Yeah.
called The Promontory People. And I think he goes into quite a bit of depth about that period in there. And I think the South Hams was the last piece of Cornwall to be ceded to Devon. So I don't know if there's any like physical evidence of it, but you'd imagine that's where the last people that spoke Cornish were. And after that, you could imagine like a city like Plymouth, being precisely on the border. You'd imagine there'd have been Cornish speakers there. And I think there's the further complication that Breton people frequently visited the UK, Cornwall in particular, but even other regions. Like there's a place in Plymouth called Bretonside, isn't there, where the bus station is and stuff. So I don't know if we can fully say for sure what was going on back then, but yeah, it makes sense. And Dartmoor's really remote place. So you think if any communities still existed, it would be somewhere around there. And I weirdly enough, I was driving through Exmoor one time, and there was like a signpost, and it had a couple of places called Tre something on it, and I was like, oh really? Like you'd get like, I don't know, somewhere in Cornwall starting with Trey, and just thinking, well, was that a little group of people who spoke Cornish or something there? I don't know, a long time ago.
Yeah, because
But
am I right in thinking that tree is basically like a farm or settlement? Is that the root?
yeah, I think if you translated it precisely, it would be ham. It would be like the ham, as in like South Ham, like
Yeah.
Trays. It's come to mean more than that, but it would mean like a farmstead, basically, in its most basic form. Yeah,
I find little things like that really, I kind of look into those things and they really fascinate me. And I kind of then start wondering about, it makes you wonder whether, for a while afterwards, whether there are little nuggets in there of, almost old Cornish isms that kind of survived through the dialect. Like we were talking about, teasy, smeechy, things like that, that have maybe had their origins in these really early roots, and then they've sort of over the centuries and centuries have sort of become part of the local area's way of speaking that maybe goes back to that period, but it's so hard to say.
it is, isn't it? It is, yeah. And yeah, just wonder if any of that got put in dialect and taken to places like Australia and America, and what words do they use informally that might come from Cornish or something like that. There must be places like in some gold mining district in America where there's some Cornish dialect words.
Yeah, you definitely hear about places like, say, quite famously like Butte, Montana, where they have the sort of you've got the evolution
Yeah,
of capacities there, and
yeah,
where there were mining communities. Yeah, you want they must have taken little bits of their language and their folklore and things like that that kind of migrate with them, if you like.
yeah. They must have done. Yeah,
I feel like I've heard you talking about having read historical texts and things like that, and that's something that really interests me. Because have you read things
yeah,
of old plays and texts in Cornish?
yeah. So we're lucky enough in the sense that out of the literature that does survive, because there were several events where sort of places where books kept. I'm not sure if they were strictly libraries, but churches and monasteries and stuff where books were kept back in the day were burnt to the ground and stuff. So there's a lot of records that don't survive, and it's a real shame because I always wonder, like, in the sort of folkloric or religious sense, what, because other places like Ireland and Wales have this huge deep mythology that stretches back to the Bronze Age or whatever, and you got to think, well, Cornwall would have had that. It comes from the same tradition. It would have had all this mythology that we don't know about anymore. And was it written down in a book somewhere that then got burnt a few hundred years ago and we don't no longer have it? And it's just like tantalizingly on the edge of, like, we don't have that, and we know it must have existed. And what we do have is oral traditions, which are much less reliable because they could have been created much later in the past than something older. But we're lucky enough to have some manuscripts, and nearly all of them are plays that come from a little earlier than Shakespeare's time, and most of them are religious in nature. So they're like the events of Jesus's life or a certain saint's life and what adventures they got up to in their life and stuff. And it's essentially a script as you would have for a play. So like character one, character two, this is the scene, etc. And back pre-Reformation, I guess, so pre Henry VIII time, pretty much every village in Cornwall had a plain and guari, which is an outdoor amphitheatre type thing. There's still one existent in St Just, in the middle of St Just, and I think that's the only physical one still standing, although there are a number of places called Plain and Guari. There's part of Redruth called Plain and Guari. There's a little hamlet called Plain and Guari near Marazion. These places, and Playing Place between Falmouth and Truro is the anglicised form of what it was called in Cornish. And pretty much every village and town had one of these. Truro had a big one, which became called Truro Castle, even though it wasn't a castle, and it's now where the magistrates' courts are. You can see it on old maps, and they used it as a cattle market or something after it fell out of use. But there was, each place did its own plays basically, and the I'm assuming the play would be kept with like the priest or the person who could read in the church or wherever. And when it came to teach the actors the lines or whatever, they'd bring that out, and people had learned the lines, and they'd like there'd be a state. We know there'd be like a stage director, directed actors, and things like this, and they'd have these multi-day performances. And sometimes in St. Just they actually recreate it. So they have like I think different parts of the Ordinalia, which is like the story of like Jesus's life, and it's all got like bits of heaven and hell and massive like puppets and things like this in it, and it involves audience participation and stuff. And it's like when you see how they did a play, it was like really interactive with the audience. It must have been quite a spectacle. It would have been like, you know, the blockbuster films of its day, the way they did it. And I guess they, back in those days, you were only allowed to do religious things. I guess you weren't like, fiction didn't really exist in the same way it does now. There were no novels and no works of pure fiction, so they had to embellish their sort of stories they had. And it's like the folklore of Christianity in Cornwall, I guess, is, you know, they embellished it with different stories, like, and work people from Cornwall into the stories, like oh, the blacksmith that made the nails to put Jesus on the cross was from such a place in Cornwall, and what have you. Like, not realistic because it all happened in the Holy Land, but there's a lot of like meta details in it that people at the time would have found entertaining and interesting and stuff. And we've got those, and you can read them as they were written in the manuscript style, and then read it in modern Cornish next to it, and sort of see what changed. There was like, they had their own alphabet characters that they used for certain words and that we don't have anymore, and things like this. But essentially, it's still quite understandable. So more understandable than if you were a modern English speaker and you read an English play from that time. It would be really difficult to understand. But we've got this, I don't know, it's changed less, I guess.
Because that was going to be one of my questions, is whether, because yeah, I wondered whether it would be like, say, yeah, English, and then looking at a text like Chaucer from the 14th century, where you've got Middle English, and you can pick out words, but it feels so different. It feels closer to sort of Old English and Anglo-Saxon.
Yeah.
But do you find that really fascinating when you're looking at them? You can kind of go, oh, I can see the evolution of what we would speak now, and how those words are carried through. That must be like a fascinating puzzle to unlock in a way.
Yeah, and it is. And that is the high point of sort of Cornish literature. That is like the golden age that we have, what's left of, you know, when Cornish was the majority language in Cornwall, and, you know, there were scholars and playwrights and people who could make these masterpieces of culture, and they were, you know, the popular culture of its day. And before that, we don't have a lot because not much has survived. We've only got scraps and fragments and some vocabularies that, you know, they're kind of understandable, but the words are like spelt quite a lot different, and it looks more like Welsh than it does like Cornish. And then you've got a period of where after Cornish had begun to decline as a majority language, people were no longer taught to read and write in Cornish. So we have a lot less records. And then the records that we do have pop up a lot later are people who maybe can speak Cornish, but were never taught to read or write Cornish, and maybe don't have the best English literary skills either. So they end up writing down Cornish with the rules of English pronunciation, spelling, syntax of the 16 and 1700s, which I think that's really difficult to unpick. One, because English in Cornwall wasn't spoken like it then, like English in Cornwall is now. It was still more like Middle English, especially in like its pronunciation. So you've got to consider that when you read it. And then you've got to consider that they didn't know how to spell Cornish. So they're spelling it as per the rules of the English of its day back then. So it looks very strange on paper. And when you compare it to Cornish that was written a little bit beforehand, when, you know, learned people had been taught to read and write Cornish, it looks like two different languages, although it is the same, but you have to unpick the latter form out of what the people are actually writing, because they didn't understand how to write Cornish. And it's just a very strange way of reading and writing. And I think Manx Gaelic in the Isle of Man went that way as well, because if you look at that, it looks nothing like how Scottish and Irish Gaelic are written. It looks like it's written by an English person trying to write what they're hearing, sort of thing. It's like it they don't compare. So they call the later one is called Late Cornish, and then the one before is Middle Cornish. And we basically base our modern spellings off Middle Cornish because they make more sense, as in it's more uniform. It was, it comes from a history of people learning to read and write, and over the centuries it developed its own written standard kind of way of being able to write it, whereas Late Cornish gives us great insight into what people and how people were speaking in the 1700s. But writing like that, they spell the same word different every time, or things like this. It's just not a good way to read and write. So the way the language has developed over time in a very interesting way towards the later end does inform how we use it now. But there have been different schools of thought in, we should spell it like they did in the 1700s, when take it up from where they left off. But that's got huge pitfalls in it, as in they don't spell it the same every time, and they one writer spells it totally different to another writer, and how do you put the two together? So basing it off a slightly earlier form where we've got thousands of pages of written words in this more regulated standard language is kind of what has been most people use as the formal way to read and write and learn.
That really fascinates me, because and one of my goals from wanting to start learning Cornish really is because as someone who's fascinated by history, I love looking at original sources. And so I'd love to be able to look at these kind of old texts, and because there's something in those that and one of the reasons I started up the Pisky Trap was because I'm always fascinated by trying to understand earlier Cornish mindsets and people's way of understanding the world around them. And even when you've got that sort of 17th, 18th century, where it sounds like it's a bit of a hodgepodge, that in itself is fascinating. Because you can see from what you're saying, it sounds like you can see what they were doing, what they were trying to achieve. But that's a moment in time in itself that you can kind of clearly see what's happening there.
Exactly, and it's also at different levels of the sort of, I don't know, social and economic spectrum, because the stuff we have from like the 1800s is from fishing communities and people who they're lucky if they learn to read and write. So it's like the modern day equivalent of like reading a group WhatsApp sort of thing, where it's all people aren't necessarily paying attention to spelling and stuff. It's they're more just using language to make it work and communicate whatever they need to. And then the earlier stuff is literally like reading your novel or your poetry collection or your your screenplay. It's been a certain amount of thought and work has been put into creating a very polished piece of work that is meant to stand the test of time, as opposed to being flippant kind of conversation in the moment. And they're two different ways of using language, as well as just being used by different sets of people, educated people versus everyday working people of the time. And we that still exists today. You can go and read a very produced piece of literature, and you can go and chat with your mates, sort of thing. It's that kind of vibe. But I also find on that same topic, we have, I guess in English, you're aware of like William Bottrell's collection of like folk tales from West Cornwall. And I think in the like actual introduction to the first one, he goes on and says most of this stuff was originally coming from the Cornish language, and then it's now, since most people have stopped speaking Cornish, it's now come into English, sort of thing. So that's interesting from that point, saying we don't actually have this and these stories in Cornish, but we know they were in Cornish because he specifically says so. So we know what kind of things they would be saying. And we do have one of the tales that he relays. I think it's called John of Chianor. We have that written down by Cornish people in the 1700s. So have that same story. I think it was written down on a couple of different occasions by different people. So we literally have that story in Cornish original, as well as William Bottrell's retelling of it that he learned from someone who, you know, ultimately it came from Cornish as well. So we do have some limited amounts of that, but not a lot.
That's a real little gem. I love finding little things like that because I often imagine, especially when you've got work like Bottrell, because he's so drawing from like droll telling traditions, and you have to
Yeah,
imagine these are oral traditions that, you know, perhaps go back centuries where they would have been originally told in Cornish, and then they've evolved, and obviously then William Bottrell, amongst some others, are among the first to be writing these down for the first time, obviously in English. But they give us these little glimpses, if you like, into how it once might have been, if you like.
yeah, and it really fascinates me how those kind of stories, a lot of them link into the natural environment, especially the stories about giants in particular. And we have, you know, the stories of that relate to the place. And one of the sort of things that said about Cornish, oh, you learn Cornish and you'll be able to understand what place names in Cornish mean. So I think understanding or knowing the folk tales and the uh, folklore and the language, it sort of gives you this understanding that, you know, once upon a time these would have been the same things, and they'd have told that story about that place in Cornish about the giant. That we still all have those pieces, but you have to put them together in different ways now because, you know, most people don't speak Cornish, so you have to sort of, you know, I work with the story about the giant on St Michael's Mount, and I know that St Michael's Mount in Cornish means this, and, you know, it's a multifaceted thing, and if you put it together, you get a bit of a deeper understanding of the place where we live.
Yeah, I remember talking with, I did an episode a while back with Mike O'Connor, and we were talking about, you know, giants and things like that. And he was saying how it kind of makes sense in places like where St. Michael's Mount is, and certain places that you get in West Cornwall, or especially when you've got like high hills and places like that, it makes sense to have stories of giants
Yeah,
just
yeah,
placed in the
absolutely.
landscape, you know, old, or they might be ancient Iron Age hill fort sites or Neolithic sites, or you know, the way that people explain the landscape around them and why things are there, geomythology, if you like.
Yeah, and there's another one about stone circles, and often they're like, oh, the merry maidens, they were frozen into stone because they danced on Sunday, or you got the hurlers who were frozen because they played hurling on Sunday or whatever. And in Cornish, the word for stone circle is Don's Main, which literally means a stone dance. So
Uh,
like that's an extra, you know, layer of understanding that like they must have the standard way of thinking about stone circle when people spoke Cornish was probably that myth that they were people frozen to stone for dancing, sort of thing.
I always like to think that there's elements like that, but then little bits get added on in terms of maybe there have been theories put forward that, you know, certain very ancient sites, then you have the Christian interpretation of that story being added into the mix from what may be
Yeah,
a much older
yeah,
story too.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, they could have been thought of as, you know, giants dancing around and got frozen to stone, and then Christianity comes on and lets in they were frozen to stone because they danced on Sunday or something. Yeah,
And this is
to
why
add
you
a
should go to
little.
church on Sunday.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Hope you're enjoying the episode. If you are, then don't forget to give us a like and subscribe. Maybe consider leaving a review, which can help other people to discover the series and also helps this project to grow. If you'd like to help support the series further, then please consider checking out my Patreon page at patreon.com/The Pisky Trap. This project is completely independent and it's funded by myself, along with the help of listener support. From as little as £1 a month, pledges on Patreon help me to cover the running costs and purchase books, materials, and gain access to historical archives as part of the research for each episode. So if you can help by offering a monthly pledge on Patreon, that'd be amazing. If not, no worries, just continuing to spread the word among friends and on social media is also a real help. Okay then, that's enough of that. Let's get back to the episode.
I wanted to get your thoughts because it feels like we're sort of naturally kind of moving into sort of almost the place names kind of thing. Because I'm endlessly fascinated by Cornish place names, but from this same book, I don't know why I'm holding it up as if I'm not being sponsored by this book or anything. But there's a theory in there, and I've heard a few people talk about this in terms of I find it quite interesting because some elements of it do make sense. That in I guess parts of eastern Cornwall, you've got more names that sound kind of Saxon. You've got like Launceston or Lanson, and it's like Lanceston. It sounds like, or Callington. They sound like very Saxon names, but I don't know if you agree or not. When I go to like West Penwith, you've got place names, and you go, that sounds very much closer to a lot of Cornish language
Yeah, yeah.
names. Do you feel like it almost is it too simple to say that? Or does it feel like you've almost got a little bit of separation in terms of where you find sort of Cornish place names?
Well, both Launceston and Callington both sound quite similar to their Cornish names. So Launceston is Llanstefan in Cornish, and Callington is Kellywick. So
Okay.
they've had a ton added to the end of them, basically. And yeah, there's in parts of East Cornwall, I think you've got three separate divisions. You've got East Cornwall, and then you've got a mid to East Cornwall bit, and then you've got a west bit. And the very eastern part of Cornwall has just some outright names that are completely Anglo-Saxon names. And then like Saltash, even the word for Saltash in Cornish is Essa, which literally means ash tree in Old English. So even the Cornish way of calling Saltash is an Anglo-Saxon word. So yeah, in the very eastern bits of Cornwall, those people would have adopted English or at least been bilingual very early on because they would have frequently been interacting with people across the Tamar for trade or whatever. And then you've got the sort of mid Cornwall bit where it was adopted. English started being adopted a bit later on, and what we kind of have there is the Cornish place names are sort of frozen in time from when Cornish was spoken back in the quite early medieval period. So like you have places that lots of places in Cornwall the same names repeat each other because some names are common because I don't know, I can't think of a specific example, but you'd have various name elements that repeat itself because it's such a common place name. And those places in West Cornwall would be spelt different than places in more east in Cornwall. And then in the very far west of Cornwall, you have place names that are just like exactly the same in Cornish, modern Cornish today. So Penzance is really similar to what Penzance is in Cornish. But then you get, I don't know, I just struggle to think of any specific examples at the moment. If I had a map in front of me, I'd probably be able to pinpoint
Yeah.
some exact places. But even Mid Cornwall was still quite similar, a lot of the words. Sometimes it's just don't use the saint's name for the place. So like St. Blaise would be called Landreath in Cornish. And obviously there's an estate called the Landreath Estate in St. Blaise, but that's not the name of the place in English, but it is in Cornish. And some of these tell you an interesting thing because the coast actually came up to St. Blaise, and Landreath means like a religious place on the beach. And St. Blaise isn't on the beach anymore, but it did used to be. And you can work out facts like that from the language as well.
Do you often find, like in that example, that that's coming back to the landscape and features in the landscape rather than the specific saint? So again, you've almost got
Yeah,
sort of hints at the original one and maybe something that's been added later on where you go, that is the place of that priory or that saint or it's associated with that individual.
yeah, exactly. And there's an interesting one. There's St. Michael's Mount. There's two names for that in Cornish, and neither of them are anything to do with St. Michael. One is Angaric Laws in Coves, which means the grey rock in the woods. And I guess if you look at it, it is a grey rock that's surrounded by trees, but those trees are only there because they've been planted as the garden before, you know, the St. Owain family or whoever planted the garden. It would have just been quite barren. But it does tell you that a long time ago there was trees around, and actually we know that. And periodically, if there's like a particular large spring tide in Mounts Bay, you'll find pieces of old trees from like 3,000 years ago in Mounts Bay, and with all their roots and stuff. And it does tell you that the landscape has changed. It was, the sea wasn't there; it was a woodland, because the for whatever reason the tide didn't come in as far or whatever, and it was a grey rock in the middle of the woods because it wasn't an island. And then the other word is Dyn Sul, which Dyn is a contraction of Dinas, which means like a kind of like a fort, and Sul, which is the word we use for Sunday, and it comes from Latin god Sol, which means the sun. So like, I don't know, fortified mountain of the sun or something like that. It means, if you translated it like that, which is probably quite an old word for it, for the
That's
place.
a good name.
Yeah.
That's almost an album name.
Yeah. Or it sounds like a bit like Lord of the Rings to me. It sounds like somewhere in Lord of the Rings. But yeah, there's quite a lot of things that will tell you a clue about history or the landscape quite often. And it doesn't matter where you are in Cornwall.
I was trying to think of examples of, where you get duplicates of, like, I think I've come across in the past couple of weeks, like 3 or 4 Polmeres.
Yeah.
Like Charlestown used to be called Polmere. There's Polmere where the ship in is near where I live.
Yeah.
And I guess again that maybe it's just because it's describing a certain feature in the landscape, and you just get that.
That's a common feature. Yeah. I think there's at least one Polmere somewhere in West Cornwall as well. So yeah, that's the kind of thing that would be repeated several times. There's you've not quite the same, but you've got Hale, the place, which just means river mouth, and then or estuary, and then you've got Eglos Hale by Wadebridge, which is just, it's got the same element of the place name in it. It just means church at the river mouth kind of thing. So those kind of words would be repeated in different place names across Cornwall.
There's some that spring out to me, and I go, that's got either an interesting story to it, or maybe I've linked 2 words together, and maybe it's not what I'm thinking it is. Like, there's a place in West Cornwall called Shy Bucker.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking that's basically like spirit house or ghost house or something like that.
Yeah, so we'd pronounce it Chibucca in Cornish, and Bucca is, that's the kind of spirit. And you get good ones and you get bad ones, but yeah, Chibucca would mean spirit's house.
I knew kind of instantly. I'm already fascinated.
What's the story there? Yeah, I've always thought that. Yeah.
And am I right in thinking? So is it Buckadoo, and is it Buckagwyn? Is the sort of
yeah. So in the sort of mythology, Buckadoo is like a bad spirit, and then Buckagwyn would be like a good spirit. So yeah, they're explicitly good and bad. Like Buckadoo is not something you'd want to meet.
It's something that crops up a bit in Bottrell's work, because he'll talk about Bucca and
yeah.
I also find it crops up in things like where you get stories about the knockers or the knackers in the mines. Sometimes they're referred to as Bucca. So there seems to be an interesting usage of the word to sometimes mean sort of sometimes little people or spirits. It seems to be quite an interesting word that has multiple usages.
Yeah, and essentially it does just mean a spirit, and I think this is where it's unfortunate that we don't have that sort of deep history thing that in Ireland they do, and they have this whole thing of like, we can categorize all these spirits, and we know the mythology behind it, and they live underground and they're part of this ancient race and stuff. And that almost certainly is where we get knockers and piskies and spridgeon and buckers and everything. That almost certainly forms a parallel sort of story that springs from the same roots, and they're almost certainly people that live in the other world or underground that come out, and they're part of the same race, and different classes of piskies and buckers and supernatural beings that they come into our world to do whatever they're going to do, whether it's mischief or whether they come to earn a living. Like the knockers are literally said to mine in mines to take it back with them wherever they're going. And yeah, Bucca would be. I think Bucca, is essentially a spirit, and could be a catch-all term for any kind of spirit. But when you specifically say Bucca, that's not a knocker. That's not a pisky. That is an evil being. And the same for Bucca Gwyn. If you, it's more like a title than it is a class of these supernatural people, I think.
There's that investigative part of me that's always wondering, like, at the roots of things. And I think when it comes to something like Bucca, you could probably write a thesis on it because it is quite a broadly used term. But there was something I wanted to talk about because I feel like when it comes to the Cornish language, sort of certainly growing up, like I was always kind of told, you get the name Dolly Pentreath is kind of thrown around a huge amount. But I thought it might be good to kind of talk about some of the kind of myths and misconceptions about the Cornish language, and particularly over the past sort of few hundred years. I was reading recently about a chap whose name I can't remember if I've written it down here. Daines Barrington, I think he was called. He sort of comes down to Cornwall and is I don't know if he's one of the first to write about having encountered Dolly Pentreath, or he sort of introduced that this is this woman who speaks Cornish fluently, and we don't know whether she spoke English or not, but kind of then writes down this encounter. But then Dolly is then kind of cited as one of these last speakers. But then even this guy says a few years later, he writes back to see, how's Dolly getting on? But then he's also told there's probably about 5 or 6 people or more who are still in Mousehole speaking Cornish.
Yeah.
I feel like there's a lot of misconceptions as to the sort of, and I hate quote unquote sort of last Cornish speakers and things, how it was presented to me when I was certainly in around primary school age. I wonder what your thoughts were on that, and a lot of the misconceptions around the Cornish language and how that has evolved and continues to be spoken now, I suppose, since.
Yeah. Well, like I said, we had to study this period in my grade 4 qualification. We had to study this period quite a lot, and Daines Barrington was a guy. He was quite disliked, I think, by common Cornish people, so they wouldn't necessarily want to speak to him, or they'd feel like he was, I don't know, didn't represent their interests, let's say, and they didn't want really anything to do with him. And we know for a fact that Dolly Pentreath made a significant part of her living from being a sort of spectacle for tourists, as like, oh, this is this old lady who speaks Cornish and she's the last one. So they were collecting money off her, making these performances to tourists visiting Penzance at the time. So she was Daines obviously spoke to her because he probably paid her to speak to her or interview her or whatever he was doing. And it's kind of like lazy journalism on his behalf because he doesn't make much of an effort to go and find anyone who speaks Cornish. Considering, I think when he was down here, he stayed in Marazion or St Michael's Mount with the Lord there, and there were still people in Marazion we have on record as being able to speak Cornish, and he comes all the way around to Mousehole, because there was a guy who used to row across every week from Marazion to Penzance to come and speak to people in Cornish, because he was one of the last people in Marazion, and he went over to Mousehole, and that was at the same time, because he regularly spoke to Dolly Pentreath. And yeah, I think it was in both the interests of Daines Barrington and Dolly Pentreath to kind of make up that she was the last person who could speak Cornish, because she made money off it, and then so he also made something off it as well. So it was kind of in their interest to say it, and the other people who spoke Cornish at the time either weren't really bothered that was going on, and couldn't really do anything to counter it because they didn't have access to the press or journalism or anything like that. But one thing that did happen is someone who was in the generation on from Dolly, so a younger person than Dolly, this fisherman from Mousehole, he actually did write a letter after Dolly Pentreath died, and he states that there's still several people who can speak Cornish in Mousehole, the generation after Dolly, and that this isn't even exploring the further hinterland of West Penwith. This isn't. Mousehole was kind of one of the hubs of Mounts Bay at the time. It wasn't really a backwater. It had quite good transport links. There was a train line that came within a few miles of it. They were transporting fish to London and stuff. It wasn't that much of a backwater, but you can imagine some place out in the moors in West Penwith. There's quite a lot of opportunities to find someone who speaks Cornish there that no one made any apparent effort to do.
Really interesting, because I remember in the section I read, it seemed like his original intention was he was headed for Sennen. And then the guide went, "No, you want to go and speak to Dolly." That almost feels like it's like this guy's been put, like it's almost like, "Oh no,
set up, yeah,
I'm going to take it." Essentially, this touristy kind of environment. Either way, it would have been written by Daines Barrington, and we have to kind of put it in perspective of what was in writing this in the first place.
Yeah, and then we still over the 1800s. There's quite little sort of that we can use in saying that definitively that people spoke Cornish, other than people saying, "Oh, my great grandma could speak Cornish." That's a secondary source, and we can't really say for definite we can prove that. But there's a guy who crops up in the late 1800s in near Zenner, and he's actually able to write bits of Cornish, and it's said that he could speak Cornish. And the guy who basically kick-started the Cornish revival and wrote the first Cornish dictionary actually went and spoke to this guy because he'd heard that he was, he knew, maybe we don't know how fluent he was exactly, but it was said that he spoke Cornish to his cat, and he lived on his own and out on the moors near Zenner, and that he is often cited now as being a more likely candidate for the last person who could speak Cornish to a reasonable degree of fluency. I mean, we can't know for sure what his level was. We don't have any recordings of him. All we have is Henry Jenner's, sort of attestation that this guy, he was a Cornish speaker. He's left us with some written words, some poems, and bits of song rhymes and nursery rhyme type things that he knows in Cornish. And I went and spoke to him, and I've learned a lot from him, sort of thing. There was very recently an academic book published that is explores the topic of if and when and how Cornish was a dead language, or what was the state of Cornish in the sort of 1800s through to the early 1900s. And it concludes, I haven't read it because it's very expensive. It's like over £100, this book, because it's like probably only a few copies made, but it's been reported in probably Cornwall Live and the BBC and stuff. So it's had secondary sort of reports on it. And it's done by a lecturer at Falmouth University, I think. And the blurb or whatever, it says that Cornish language didn't actually die out at any point. As we define a language dying out, I think we can say it died out as the language of the community, because if there's even if there's people who can speak it, if it's not the main language that everyone's using day to day, then it's not the language of the community. And I think in that sense, we can say it died off as the main language, but people definitely have always been able to speak it, even if it's only been a small handful.
That's interesting, because I think it confirms my suspicion that it was still carrying on in little pockets, that it wasn't this kind of completely broken line, that it was still carrying on in certain areas. So that I find really, really fascinating. What would you like to see in the future, kind of going forward for the Cornish language, and what would you like to see in the kind of coming years, I suppose?
So from my point of view, I'm someone who's raising my kids in Cornish so that they'll grow up and they'll be able to speak Cornish without having ever been to lessons or anything. They'll just know it because I've raised them in Cornish. And I would like there to be more people for them to interact with. So more children and more young people speaking Cornish. I think there's a lot of effort being made to create content and to encourage people to use more Cornish. Although if I look at other places in the world and other languages where they have minority languages, like for example New Zealand, where they have the Maori language. They make huge efforts, and they have, you know, massive amounts of resources that go into teaching people. They have schools and communities where this is the main language all over the world, in different places, with Native American languages in North America, in Ireland and Wales. You know, they have full TV services and stuff, and we don't have any of that. So even if people learn Cornish, there's not enough of it to immerse themselves in it on a day-to-day basis. So I'd love there to be more content created in Cornish, in every aspect, really, in screen and literature and radio, and just community interactions. I mean, there's a nice little community here in Penzance where I can go. I know on 2 or 3 different occasions a week, I could go and meet a group of people who are speaking Cornish, which is great. But I'd love for that to be broadened, and I'd love for my kids to, you know, have an incentive to stick with it and to use it into adulthood, other than just me. Like, from my selfish point of view, I'll be happy if they just speak to me in Cornish, because that's essentially why I've taught them. But if they could go out into the wider community and continue to use it as part of the community, that would make me really happy. But I think to encourage more people to do that, there needs to be a reason and a drive. And it's often cited that, oh, you should learn Cornish because you're Cornish and this is Cornwall. So, but that only gets so far and so many people, because like on a day-to-day basis, you need things to be fun and exciting, and you need a draw, and you need social activities and stuff. You can't just say you should speak Cornish because you're a Cornish boy. And that, I think that's been proven over however many decades that doesn't really draw that many people to the language. I think there does have to be cultural benefits of it. You have to be able to watch a nice film or read a book or play a game with your friends. And I think that's where I'd like to see the language go, where people choose it because it's fun for them and it's a nice thing to do, rather than have a sort of a motivation that's driven by, you know, ideology, or you've got to do it because, I don't know, whatever. I know I did. I learned the language because I had a sort of that kind of motivation. But having learned the language and experienced, you know, social life with the language, I can see that it's more than just, I don't know, that veneer of, oh, you're Cornish, so you have to speak Cornish. And it's, you know, a lot of the people who learn Cornish are people who've moved here anyway. So like, it does need to be broader, and it does need to have an element of fun and social activity, I think, is what's going to really make the language succeed.
That was my chat with Owain Holland. A big thank you to Owain for taking the time to chat. And I highly recommend checking out the Cornish Language podcast, which I've popped a link to below. And if you're interested in learning Cornish, Owain has kindly sent me some helpful links, so I've also added those into the show notes as well. That's it from me. I hope that you enjoyed this episode and you found it interesting. We'll be back again very soon to explore another local topic. But for now, take care and thanks for listening. The Pisky Trap is presented by me, Keith Wallace, with music by Elizabeth Westcott and artwork by Caris Harrington.